The world is your own world, and you can change it however you like. So I've been thinking about this recently, and this kind of spontaneously sort of brought on by this book I'm reading by Andrew Gallimore called Reality Switch Technologies. It deals with psychedelic drugs, and it kind of puts forth the idea that all different psychedelic drugs work by the same sort of mechanistic underpinning, which is that they change how our brain represents the world. Now, we're not going to be talking about psychedelic drugs here. We're going to be talking about something that he brings up in the first chapter of the book, and I've been thinking about, and that is the idea that the brain is a machine that is involved in making the world, literally. So here's our brain, and all our brains are pretty much like this. We're floating around in fluid inside our skulls, just like this guy, except he's got a jar. And when we say the world in like common speech, when we're talking about it, we have this idea that the world is sort of like external, right? And that the world is sort of input into our heads, and we sort of have like a representation of what's out there. But this way of thinking about it's not quite right? Our brain is a world-generating machine, and it is generating our worlds inside it, and it's doing that on a bunch of complicated ways. And sort of the goal of the brain is to represent the environment, which is out here, in a way that makes sense, evolutionarily speaking, right? So what we really mean when we say the world in like normal everyday speech is probably something like the external environment, right? It's the thing that we all point to and we can all agree on. It's the table we all agree that the thing exists in the world. But the thing exists in the environment, there it is. But the world is really yours. The world is your experience alone. And so it's not quite right to say that you are experiencing the external environment. You're not. The experience is in your head. And brains... Anyway, in the first chapter of this book, Andrew Gallimore talks about how brains work by predictive processing. Now, this is sort of one of our scientific theories about how neurocognitive processing works, and it basically has the idea that the brain is sort of doing two things. It is predicting the world, and it is receiving inputs and generating error signals. And so here we have 3 layers. There's a lot more than 3 layers. But the idea is the bottom layers of our brain, layer 1 and whatever, the lower level layers are involved with, they map onto inputs from the environment. So here's our environment, right? And the idea is that our brain is involved at the higher levels of predicting what the world's going to be like. So it's making a model of the world, and it is testing it on the lower levels. And that's called top-down processing, right? So it's basically generating a representation of what it thinks the world is going to be based on its past experience, testing it on the input layers, and the input layers generate error signals or bottom-up processing to correct the prediction. Okay, so we can think about, we can think about illusions. Like one of the famous examples is the hollow mask illusion. So our brains are predicting that faces are concave, right? Because all faces are concave. It's like a ingrained prediction that our neurology sort of just like sees a face and it goes, it's concave. But then when the mask spins around and you see that it's convex, our visual sort of input layers generate an error signal and correct the model, and that sort of flips around in our representation of the world. We see it as convex, and then we see it as concave all of a sudden, because the error signal has done bottom-up processing, corrected the prediction that the brain's making. All right, so that's sort of predictive processing for you. But the thing that I've been thinking about is that it's not just visual processing that our brain is doing. It's also doing, maybe a better way of saying this is, it's not just visual, audio, tactile inputs that we're talking about when we're talking about a world representation. Because if you think about your experience, and that's really what I mean by the world in this sense, is the experience of the world. And there's a bunch of other stuff included in that, like memories, beliefs, thoughts, right? These are all experiences, but they don't come from the environment. They come from the internal environment, right? They're generated by our brains, but they're still inputs into our neurology, right? And so our brain is still predicting the world based on all these inputs. And so I think beliefs is a particularly important one. We can think about beliefs. Let's take a standard dichotomy belief, right? I'm an introvert or I'm an extrovert. They're the two. Pick one, you have to pick one. Are you an introvert or are you an extrovert, right? Well, that belief becomes part of your world generating machine in your head. And that belief becomes an input, and your brain starts predicting the world, the way the world is, on the basis of that belief and all the other beliefs that you've collected and all the other inputs you're collecting from your outside world. And so if you're at a party and you have this belief that you're introverted, your brain is going to represent the world to be, less inviting, more scary, socializing's hard, negative emotions about lots of people at once, right? It's going to predict that the world is like that. And unless it has an error signal, unless it has bottom-up error to correct that prediction, then it's going to reinforce itself and keep predicting that the world is like that. And so this is sort of the crux of my sort of understanding here, is that beliefs and thoughts and memories and things that happen to you and things that you think in your own head, your brain predicts that the world is going to be as per those things, and without any error signals to correct them, that's a reinforcing thing. And so fundamentally, your world contains your beliefs. If you believe that you're introverted, the world is represented to you like you're introverted. If you believe you're extroverted, your brain is predicting, and without any error signals to correct it, the world is just presented to you like that, right? If you say you're an optimistic person, if you think you're an optimistic person, you believe it, then the world is presented to you in a more hopeful way, because that's the way your brain has learned to predict the world. And the error signals that it's going to be looking for the error signals to back itself up, right? It wants to reinforce that model, and that is cognitive bias, right? When we think a certain way, we see the world a certain way, and then we use that to confirm our hypotheses. And so here's how you can change the world, literally the world, is you can specifically do things that induce error signals to sort of reorganize how your brain is predicting the world to be. So if you think you're introverted, you've had a belief you've introverted, you've been telling yourself that you've introverted your entire life, right? Then maybe you can do things that an extroverted person would do, that an introverted person wouldn't. And that's going to feel extremely uncomfortable, but it's going to generate the error signals. And once you do that long enough, your brain, and you think to yourself, I'm not an introvert, then eventually that is going to disappear from your predictive model, and you are no longer going to see the world, literally experience the world like you're an introverted person. And this goes for all our beliefs. This goes for our memories as well, like how you think about your past memories is sort of how you perceive, how you're like interpreting future events to happen. So I guess the sort of takeaway here is that the predictive world generating model of the brain doesn't just apply to visual inputs and our brain predicting how the world looks or sounds. It's also how the world is. And it's not just visual inputs, it's also what you tell yourself, what you're thinking to yourself, what you believe in, right? These are all inputs, and they're all affecting how you see the world, literally, the world, because the world's in your head.